On June 4, 1943, in Mexia, Texas, on Railroad Street. When Unteroffizier Werner Burkhardt was writing in his secret journal, the pencil shook slightly. He was scribbling remarks that, if discovered by his own officers, would have resulted in him being placed in solitary prison. It is clear that the Americans are deceiving us. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts, he had just seen from the window of the train, which was something that contradicted the propaganda that the Nazis had been spreading for the last 3 years. Every single farmhouse, every single street corner, and every single store window was lit up with electric lights, creating a seemingly limitless constellation of electricity that stretched across the Texas plains around 10 o'clock at night. Since the year 1940, the German Reich had been in complete darkness due to the restrictions that imposed blackouts. Even before the war, only around 20% of German farms had access to electricity in rural areas. In spite of this, electricity flowed like water in this place, which Nazi propaganda had depicted as a decadent and destroyed America. Over 1,850 veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps disembarked off the passenger train. These were not cattle cars or freight wagons. Rather, they were padded Pullman coaches that had dining services and sleeping accommodations. For the purpose of seeing their arrival, the whole population of Mexia had gathered together. It was unknown to any of them that this particular moment would be the catalyst for the most profound psychological transition in the history of contemporary prisoners of war. This transformation would include the methodical destruction of Nazi ideology by the sheer exhibition of American industrial ability. Rather of being written in combat plans, the arithmetic of Allied triumph was being written in production numbers. These data would eventually destroy every assumption that these troops had about their adversaries, their nation, and their cause. Tunisia was the location where the collapse had started on May 13, 1943. Along with around 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian forces, Rommel's successor, General Jürgen von Arnim, surrendered with them. As scattered troops continued to surrender over the course of many days, the numbers came in a variety of forms. The most experienced desert warriors of the Wehrmacht were taken prisoner all of a sudden. These was a group of soldiers who had successfully drove the British back to Egypt and who had gained the grudging admiration of Montgomery himself. A veteran of the France campaign who had been wounded twice in North Africa, Hauptmann Friedrich Radke was one of the individuals who was among them. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. His journal, which was found in the National Archives many years later, would give historians with the most comprehensive description of the psychological impact that being held captive by the United States of America had on German troops living in Germany. It was in the port of Oran, Algeria, when the trip from defeat to revelation officially started. While Radke and 30,000 other prisoners of war were waiting in improvised camps for transport ships, the efficiency of the United States was already beginning to break through their preconceived notions. On a daily basis, the United States Army processed thousands of detainees with an organizational accuracy that was superior to anything the Wehrmacht had accomplished, even when it was at the pinnacle of its abilities. Identification cards were photographed and filed away. The medical tests were finished, the vaccinations were given, and the rights guaranteed by the Geneva Convention were outlined in German by American officials who had been prepared expressly for this time. The first major surprise, however, was the meal that was served. When Obergefreiter Hans Müller was taken with the 21st Panzer Division, he wrote to his mother 8 months later, saying, "While we were waiting for ships in the cage at Oran, the Americans fed us better than we had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. Real coffee, white bread, and meat at least twice a day. We were under the impression that it was propaganda for the purpose of attempting to impress us. It was not brought to our attention that this was their usual military ration." For their part, the Liberty ships that were going to transport them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to the industrial prowess of the United States. If the Germans had been aware of the fact that the SS Robert E. Peary had been constructed in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, they wouldn't have believed it and would have considered it impossible propaganda. Returned from transporting supplies to the European theater, these vessels, which were constructed at a pace of 3 per day during the peak of production, were returning from their journey. Instead of sailing back empty, they carried human cargo, which by the summer of 1943 might reach up to 30,000 prisoners of war every month. The psychological demolition was completed in its second phase during the 2-week Atlantic voyage that took place in July of 1943. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, who served in the 90th Light Division, maintained a thorough narrative, which was passed down to his family in the form of letters after he was returned home. It was brought to his attention that the crew of the ship disposed of more food trash on a daily basis than his whole unit had gotten in weekly rations over the last few months of their time in Africa. According to what Zimmermann found in his writing, the American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, and gallons of milk that had been sitting for too long. They did this openly and without any concern, not to make fun of us, but because they understood that this waste was of no consequence to them. Their amount of supply was unbounded. The ships themselves began to function as floating schools for the American government. The prisoners of war realized that the ship that was transporting them was one of the 2,710 Liberty ships that were going to be constructed during the war. Each Liberty ship would require 250,000 pieces to be assembled from components that were created in 32 different states. According to the information that they obtained from the American guards who were talking, the engines were manufactured in 3 different factories, each of which produced cylinders with 900 horsepower. These cylinders were then assembled in ports that had hardly existed 2 years prior. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stauffen, whose aristocratic Prussian family had participated in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This was written in reference to the fact that the radar antenna was rotating above the bridge. This technology, which we believed to be possessed in restricted numbers by just ourselves and maybe the British, was considered to be standard equipment aboard a cargo vessel. It was at that moment that I got my first inkling that Germany had already been defeated in the war." The 2nd of August, 1943, at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia City. Those final vestiges of Nazi propaganda regarding the industrial weakness of the United States were obliterated when they saw the United States for the first time. A total of dozens of ships were concurrently loaded and unloaded by cranes at the Norfolk facility, which was spread out across 400 to 300 acres and had docks that stretched for miles as well. This one port was responsible for the handling of more tonnage in a single day than the whole German port of Hamburg was able to handle in a week. In the time before he was drafted into the military, Gefreiter Johann Weber, a manufacturing worker from the Ruhr region, counted 47 cargo ships that were in different stages of loading or unloading. Each crane lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horses in Germany, he wrote in his secret notebook. In Germany, the load would have not been lifted. The coal smoke that suffocated our industrial cities was not present in their movement, which was smooth and continuous, and they moved with electric power. For the purpose of the march to the trains that were waiting, the captives were organized into columns. As they traveled down the path, they came across parking areas that were crammed with civilian vehicles, hundreds of which belonged to different dock workers. Throughout the history of Germany, the possession of private automobiles remained a luxury reserved for the rich and the party elite. Due to the fact that less than 1,000 Volkswagens were ever delivered to civilians, the Volkswagen, which had been promised to the German people since 1934, remained a propaganda dream. Ordinary workers arrived to their places of employment in their own vehicles. Not boxcars, not the 40 and 8 wagons, 40 men or 8 horses that had transported German troops across Europe, but full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with padded seats that converted to sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, and observation cars with panoramic windows. Nothing could have prepared them for the specific trains that they would be riding. "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners," Hauptmann Radke recounted. The American guards appeared to be almost embarrassed by the level of comfort they were experiencing. The air conditioning in our vehicle was not functioning correctly, and one of the sergeants expressed their regret for this. Radke added, "Air conditioning to the list." Back in August, we were under the impression that such opulence could only be found aboard Hitler's private train. Although the rail voyage from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma would take 3 days, it would prove to be more detrimental to the ideology of the Nazi Party than any military loss. The convicts pressed their faces against the glass as the trains traveled through Virginia, viewing a version of the United States of America that, according to all they had been told, was absolutely impossible to exist. The lights were shining brightly in every single little town. Communities such as Martinsville, Danville, and Greensboro, which in Germany would have been fortunate to have even a single electric street lighting, featured lit store windows, electric signage, and residences with lights glowing in numerous rooms. During the night shift, the trains passed industries that were operating at night, with their windows blazing and parking lots being filled even at midnight. A letter that was found in 1987 had the following words written by Obergefreiter Meyer, whose father was a Nazi Party block leader in Hamburg. "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Everyone had access to more electricity than the whole city of Hamburg." According to the guards, this was a common occurrence, and that every town in the United States had electricity since the 1920s. I referred to him as a liar. He simply shrugged his shoulders and muttered, "We will see." The train made a stop at Roanoke, Virginia, in order to fill up with water and coal. As the prisoners observed, American railway workers completed tasks that would have taken German laborers 2 hours to complete in 30 minutes. These tasks included the operation of automatic coal loaders, electric water pumps, and mechanized lubrication systems. The technological superiority of the operation was evident in every facet of the operation. Even more unsettling was the fact that the workers themselves had a precarious financial situation. Those boots were made of leather and would have cost a German worker 2 months' worth of salary to purchase it. Coca-Cola was consumed from glass bottles, and the empty bottles were discarded into trash cans without any consideration. Continuously smoking cigarettes, they would stub them out before they were even halfway done. Feldwebel Hinrich Müller, an electrical engineer who worked for Siemens before to the war, made the calculation that the single train yard and where they halted consumed more electricity in a single hour than his whole area in Berlin consumed in a single day. It was written by him that the waste was magnificent. They left lights burning in buildings that were now vacant. Electric fans were running in rooms that were empty. Specifically, it was the irresponsibility of an endless resource. When the inmates were traveling through Tennessee and Kentucky on the railroads, they were confronted with the full exhibition of the industrial prowess of the United States. They observed an unending number of factories, each of which was far larger than anything that the majority of them had seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum facility in Tennessee was located along the river and spanned for 3 miles. The electric furnaces at the plant consumed 175,000 kilowatts of power, which was greater than the power consumption of the whole city of Munich. In the vicinity of Louisville, the trains slowed down as they passed the Rubbertown complex. This complex consisted of 4 enormous facilities, each of which employed thousands of workers and produced 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber yearly. These factories had sprung from barren fields in just 18 months. The Germans had never been able to produce more than 120,000 tons in their greatest year, despite the fact that they had invented the technique. An instant comprehension of the ramifications was exhibited by Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, a chemist working for IG Farben. "I knew those plants," he recounted in an interview that took place after the war. It was possible for me to observe the distillation columns as well as the catalytic cutters. Not only were there 4 of these facilities in this one area, but each one was more technologically sophisticated than anything else that we had constructed. They informed us that there were hundreds more in other parts of the nation. The Willow Run factory, which is located outside of Detroit and can be seen from miles away, was traversed by the trains. Each and every 63 minutes, this one plant, which was constructed in just 9 months, was capable of producing a B-24 Liberator aircraft. Bombers were constructed by 42,000 personnel from a total of 1,550,000 parts that were made by 1,500 subcontractors during the peak manufacturing period. A total of 2.5 million square feet of floor area was utilized by the facility, and it consumed more power than the whole city of Cologne in Germany. As they flew by, Hauptmann Wehrli, a Luftwaffe pilot who had been shot down over Tunisia, pushed his face against the window. As he looked out from the train, he spotted 17 B-24s that were in various states of construction. The author claimed, "We had been told that American planes were inferior, that they were built hastily, and that they would fall apart in combat." However, he was able to observe the accuracy of the manufacturing lines and the quality of the building. These were not substandard airplanes in any way. The speed with which they were constructed was simply beyond our ability to conceive about. The annihilation of Nazi mythology became increasingly in-depth and comprehensive as the trains continued to penetrate farther into the American continent. While they were in St. Louis, they traveled across the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge. Below them, barges were transporting more grain than the whole crop that Germany had produced in 1942. The captives were able to view grain elevators that stretched along both sides, each of which had sufficient wheat to provide sustenance for a German city for several months. According to the entries that Unteroffizier Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, made in his journal, the Americans transport food as we transport ammunition in endless quantities, without concern for loss. The amount of wheat that they loaded onto a single barge was sufficient to provide food for my entire town for a period of 5 years. The operator of the crane was consuming a sandwich that included meat that was thicker than our supply for the week. One of the stops that the train made in Kansas City was at a vast stockyard that housed tens of thousands of animals that were waiting to be slaughtered. Over a long distance, the air was filled with the aroma of meat-packing facilities. In the event that they were fortunate, German prisoners of war who had survived in Africa on a weekly diet of 200 grams of meat were able to observe American laborers enjoying beef sandwiches during their lunch break. On the other hand, Gefreiter Paul Fischer noted that they ate meat like we ate bread. No, it is not correct. People ate meat in the same way that we hoped we could eat bread. For 15 cents, the guard purchased hamburgers from a stand located next to the station. These hamburgers had beef, cheese, and veggies on white bread. Without prior consideration, he purchased 20 of them and paid for them with a single dollar bill. Not much stood out about this. This was their typical intake of food. It was the arrival of the camps itself that brought about the next phase of cognitive destruction. Camp Hearn, Texas, was constructed in just 4 months and housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most people had known to be considered civilians. These conditions included wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heat. Additionally, each building was constructed with more lumber than entire German villages had. Those who worked in the medical field among the detainees were astonished by the camp hospital. Oberstleutnant Dr. Friedrich Bauer, the head surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself at a facility that was more equipped than the majority of German civilian hospitals. This facility had X-ray machines, surgical equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies that had not been accessible in Germany since 1941. He pointed out that there was every standard provision for enemy prisoners. After some time had passed, Dr. Bauer would testify that they possessed penicillin, a miraculous medication that we had only heard whispers about. They did not hesitate to use it, even on inmates who complained of small diseases. As a result of a lack of basic sulfur medications, German troops were dying, and the Americans were giving us their most modern treatment without any hesitation. In the process of American affluence, the camp kitchen evolved into yet another school. The inmates, who were given the responsibility of preparing meals, discovered that there were walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automatic dishwashers, and gas ovens that were capable of preparing meals for thousands of men. The German civilian population had not been provided with amounts of fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread since 1939. The daily ration consisted of these items. The following is a quote from Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich. "Today we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. This is not food that has gone bad, rather it is simply excess." In order to guarantee that every prisoner receives their full rations, the American standards dictate that we prepare 10% extra than is required. All of the extra is thrown away. I was overcome with emotion as I tossed away bread that was in wonderful condition. In September of 1943, the lack of available labor in the agricultural sector of the United States led to the employment of prisoners of war in fields and industries all around the country. Because of the exigency of the situation, this choice would prove to be more detrimental to the ideology of the Nazi Party than any propaganda effort could have accomplished. On a regular basis, groups of inmates were transported by truck to place of employment, and they traveled through the heartland of the United States without blindfolds or limited routes. They witnessed everything, including the never-ending fields of grain and wheat, the factories operating on 3 shifts, the stores brimming with merchandise, the parking lots crammed with automobiles, and the homes that were equipped with radios and refrigerators. At a cotton gin just outside of Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang witnessed a single machine process more cotton in a single hour than his entire hamlet could have handled in a month if they had relied on more conventional means. In 1943, the Colorado River Authority had completed a rural electrification program that had supplied energy to 90% of Texas farms. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority. Lang made a recording that stated, "The farmer who owned the gin was nobody special. He was not a member of the party, he was not a member of the aristocracy, but he was in possession of a tractor, a vehicle, a car, and power. He also had running water. His employees, including the African Americans, ate their lunches from boxes that included more food than the week's worth of food that German workers received. This was, in fact, the standard. Every farm that we went by was exactly the same." During their time in jail in Nebraska, inmates labored in sugar beet fields and witnessed agricultural machinery that was beyond their comprehension. It was discovered that a single combine harvester could do the tasks of 100 individuals. Every one of the fields was larger than an entire German county, and they stretched all the way to the horizon. With a casual tone, the farmers discussed harvests that would have been almost unimaginable in Germany. 60 bushels of wheat per acre, in contrast to 30 bushels on the greatest soil in Germany. During his time working on a farm outside of Scottsbluff, Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote the following. "The farmer's son, a boy of 16 years old, drove a tractor that was worth more than everything my father had earned in his lifetime. When I brought this up, the young man chuckled and stated that it wasn't even a tractor that should be considered very nice. One of his father's expectations was that John Deere will release a new model that would be even more superior." Those convicts who worked for American factories or in close proximity to them were the ones who received the most damaging information. However, prisoners of war were permitted to work in industries that freed up American labor for military production, despite the fact that the Geneva Convention restrictions barred direct war production activity. Thousands of German POWs were able to experience the industrial capabilities of the United States of America firsthand because, to this technicality, Prisoners were able to observe manufacturing lines at a Campbell's soup facility in New Jersey that processed more tomatoes in a single day than the majority of German firms did in a month. Even though the plant had a skeleton workforce consisting of women and old men, since the majority of the youthful workers were serving in the war, productivity levels were higher than they were during times of peace. At his documentation of the event, Stabsfeld-Webel Ernst Wagner, who had worked at a German food processing facility before the war, stated that everything was automated: electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, and steam cookers that processed hundreds of cans simultaneously. What would have taken 50 staff in Germany was managed by a single old woman who was responsible for monitoring the regulations. Her actions were carried out while she was consuming coffee and listening to the radio. In the vicinity of Detroit, inmates who were unloading coal at a power plant were able to catch views of the automobile industry's transition to production for the war. A total of 100,000 people were working at the River Rouge complex, which was visible across the lake and produced tanks, aircraft engines, and jeeps. The facility had a daily electrical use of 1.5 million kilowatts, which was greater than the consumption of the whole city of Hamburg. In his writing, Obergefreiter Franz Kellner stated that they were able to view the parking lots, thousands of automobiles that belonged to the employees. The majority of workers in Germany, including our officers, did not possess automobiles. Here, manufacturing workers commuted to their jobs by car. It was reported to us by the security that many employees had 2 automobiles, one for their work and one for their family. We believed that he was making fun of us. The cumulative effect of these observations was causing what American intelligence operatives referred to as ideological collapse syndrome among the captives by the time winter 1943 rolled around. It was noted by the Special Projects Division, which is the covert re-education program that is overseen by the Office of the Provost Marshal General, that a rising number of convicts were asking access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. The prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. Major Paul Newland, a member of the monitoring team, observed in December 1943. The prisoners have become more compliant. It is too much for them to bear. At this point, even the most zealous Nazis have grown silent. Even if they continue to show their allegiance to Germany, they no longer talk about winning. The things that they were told about America are being publicly questioned by many. In the camp publications, which were published by the inmates themselves, this transition started to become apparent. Der Ruf, the cry that was issued at Fort Kearny in Rhode Island, eventually turned from themes of rebellious nationalism to debates of democracy, economic systems, and post-war reconstruction. The editors, who were anti-Nazi convicts who had been carefully picked, discovered that their readership was becoming more receptive. We were told that America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, controlled by Jews, and incapable of military prowess, wrote Lieutenant Hermann Gott, who was captured with the 10th Panzer Division. The letter was managed to pass through the censorship process in the United States. Whenever I come here, I am confronted with the opposite. This nation is the most strong, cohesive, and well-organized nation on the entire planet. Criminals told us stories that were like fairy tales. The treatment of Italian POWs following Italy's surrender in September 1943 was the unanticipated source of the most damaging blow to the ideology of the Nazi Party. Those Italian prisoners of war who decided to collaborate were organized into Italian service groups, where they were provided with improved living conditions, higher pay, and greater freedom. During their time in jail, German prisoners witnessed their former comrades working alongside Americans, dining in American restaurants, and even beginning relationships with American women. In his writings, Hauptmann Friedrich Schultz stated, "Despite the fact that the Italians have betrayed us, they are treated better than we have treated them as allies. They are able to work without restriction, make money, and send parcels back home. They are not shown any hostility by the Americans. The democracy that we were taught to loathe looks to be more respectable than the system that we have now in place. The most significant psychological impact was brought forth by Christmas holiday 1943. More than 500,000 Christmas parcels were given to German prisoners of war POWs by American organizations, churches, and civic groups. These German POWs were adversaries who had been attempting to murder American soldiers months before. Cigarettes, sweets, hygiene, and certain games were included in each individual bundle. Prisoners were invited to Christmas dinners by their local communities, but laws prevented the majority of them from accepting the invitation. The convicts at Camp Hearn, Texas, were treated to German-language renditions of Christmas songs sung by the choir of the local Methodist church. Homemade cakes and sweets were delivered in by women from the town of Hearn. Christmas cards that were handcrafted were delivered by the Boy Scouts. All of the last pieces of Nazi racial ideology were destroyed as a result of this benevolence for foes. In his letter, Oberleutnant Walter Muller, whose brother had been killed in the bombing of Hamburg, stated, "They are aware that we are their adversaries. In many cases, our sons and spouses are engaged in combat with our armed forces. However, they demonstrate Christian generosity, which is not propaganda, but rather real thoughtfulness." What type of individuals would treat their adversaries in such a manner? Only those who are without a doubt convinced of their success and who are confident in their ability. The Christmas feast itself was beyond conception. It consisted of turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, veggies, pies, and ice cream. These were proportions of food that Germany had not seen since before the First World War. The inmates were unable to grasp the lavishing of such riches on their adversaries, so they continued to eat until they were ill. Feldwebel Hansa noted that we ate like kings, referring to the fact that we ate better than German generals eat and better than party leaders. And this was nothing out of the ordinary. The security personnel informed us that this was a typical Christmas dinner in the United States, and that every family in the country was enjoying the same meal. What do they have to eat for their own soldiers if they are able to feed prisoners in such a manner? More than 40,000 German prisoners had already signed up for educational programs by the beginning of 1944. They made studies in English, mathematics, the sciences, and the history of the United States. Courses might be taken through the University of Chicago's correspondence program. Professors from Stanford University were invited to give lectures on the topics of economics and democracy. It was impossible to quench the hunger for knowledge. Prisoners who had been persuaded that Americans were barbarians without culture discovered libraries that had millions of volumes, institutions that welcomed students from all socioeconomic groups, and scientific research that was at the forefront of the United States. Without restriction, they read newspapers from the United States and compared different points of view, which was not permitted in Nazi Germany. Camp Shelby was the location where Hauptmann Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a scientist who had been conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, took lectures on atomic physics. His subsequent writings include the following. American professors, including Jewish refugees from Germany, taught us without hatred. They referred to science as something that was universal and belonged to all of humanity. Their research was years ahead of that of the Germans, and they shared their expertise with their adversaries. The brains that were formed by the ideology of the Nazi Party were unable to comprehend this generosity of spirit. In the cinemas of this camp, American films were shown. They were not propaganda pictures, but rather typical Hollywood movies. There was a picture of American loss and rehabilitation in the film Gone with the Wind, which resonated with the prisoners since it was similar to their own current predicament. They were astounded by the fact that Americans would be so self-critical of their adversaries after watching The Grapes of Wrath. According to what Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote, they hide nothing. They reveal their difficulties, their shortcomings, and the conflicts that they face. On the other hand, as a result of their honesty, they remain stronger. A critique of this nature would result in death in Germany. On this occasion, it is seen as patriotic. In the spring of 1944, increased prisoner labor programs were implemented as the United States reached its highest level of output. POWs from Germany were forced to labor in factories, mills, and fabrication facilities, where they were exposed to the full potential of the American manufacturing sector. It was impossible for any propaganda to refute the tale that the data revealed. Inmates at the Higgins boat factory in New Orleans were responsible for unloading steel that was going to be used to construct landing craft for D-Day. They observed as workmen put together 700 boats per month, with each boat requiring 20,000 components. A total of 20,000 people were employed at the facility, including thousands of women who were responsible for managing manufacturing lines, operating cranes, and welding exteriors. Women doing men's work, Negroes operating complex machinery, teenagers running drilling equipment. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy, writes Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann. Everything we were told was impossible in a democracy. Despite this, manufacturing never ceased. It was carried out in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They manufactured more vessels in a single month than our entire Navy constructed in an entire year. People who were incarcerated at Republic Steel in Ohio were able to observe the daily manufacture of 10,000 tons of steel. The blast furnaces were constantly operating, and they were supplied with iron ore and coal from Pennsylvania and Minnesota in the form of unending trains. The size was beyond the grasp of the Germans. When it was at its peak, this one facility produced more steel than the whole Ruhr region combined. During the time before the war, I was employed by Krupp, as stated by Obergefreiter Paul Hartmann. I was under the impression that I had a firm grasp of industrial manufacturing, but this was beyond my comprehension. As a result of the leakage, they squandered more steel than we were able to create. Despite the fact that they were generating amounts that we were unable to accomplish with slave labor and double hours, the workers grumbled about working overtime. The final destruction of Nazi propaganda concerning the fragility of the United States of America occurred with the summer harvest of 1944. Prisoners from Germany were forced to work across the Midwest, where they witnessed agricultural productivity that could feed the whole globe. The wheat harvests in Kansas were observed, and it was observed that individual farms produced more grain than the whole German provinces combined. Each combine was capable of harvesting 100 acres per day, and they sailed over the fields like ships sailing across an ocean of gold. They were able to fill grain elevators that were capable of holding more wheat than Germany would import in an entire year. A farmer from East Prussia named Unteroffizier Franz Weber claimed that one American farmer with machinery does the work of 100 German farmers. Photographs taken from above showed me the wheat fields, which covered hundreds of square miles and contained grain. Even if they lost half of their harvest, they would still have more than each and every country in Europe combined. Prisoners in the Central Valley of California were responsible for picking fruit from orchards that extended beyond the reach of the eye. They observed as perfectly fine fruit that would have been prized in Germany was thrown away due to tiny imperfections, even though it was absolutely good. The idea that whole fields were sometimes plowed under in order to preserve prices was a thought that drove convicts from hunger-ravaged Germany to have a catastrophic breakdown in their mental health. According to what Gefreiter Otto Schultz wrote, they destroyed food in order to keep prices stable. Because they had an excessive amount of oranges, mountains of them were bulldozed into pits. We pleaded with the staff to grant us permission to transfer them to our family in Germany. The security personnel showed compassion, but they stated that it was not feasible. This squandering served as strategic evidence that there are endless resources. In 1944, on June 6th, as soon as the news of the invasion of Normandy reached the camps, the German inmates went through their ultimate ideological breakdown. The magnitude of the operation, which included 6,000 ships, 11,000 planes, and 150,000 soldiers in the initial wave, displayed the organizational capabilities of the United States above and beyond what Nazi Germany could have imagined. Within a few of days, inmates that were held at Camp Shelby viewed newsreels about the invasion. The supply system that transported 15,000 tons of goods per day over open beaches was visible to them, as were the endless streams of ships, the artificial ports, and the supply system. They witnessed the destruction of their motherland at the hands of the very nation that they had been counseled to believe was incapable of fighting. We knew then that everything was lost. Not just the war, but the entire Nazi project, wrote Oberst Friedrich von Tobian. We knew that everything was lost. Fairy tales and race mythology were the weapons that we used to oppose the most powerful industrial power in the world. By sending horses against their trucks, firearms against their automatic weapons, and courage against their limitless resources, we showed our determination to defeat them. Throughout their time in captivity, German captives were exposed to something that posed a greater threat to Nazi ideology than any financial prosperity possible: the compassion of the American people. Prisoners of war encountered a people that were confident enough in their own power to extend mercy, despite the fact that propaganda portrayed Americans as being weak and emotional. Following the tragic death of Gefreiter Hans Muller's son in the bombing that occurred in Hamburg, the American camp commander personally brought the letter from the Red Cross and expressed his sorrow. When the widow of Lieutenant Paul Fisher wrote that she was having trouble providing for their children, religious groups from the United States sent food packages to her in Germany. These supplies were given to enemy civilians in a country that the United States was actively bombing. Hauptmann Otto claimed that the German people were distanced from the Nazi regime as a result of their actions. Rather of battling Germans, they said they were fighting Hitler. It turned out that this distinction, which appeared to be propaganda, was in fact true. It was not their intention to destroy Germany. Rather, they prepared us to reconstruct it after the war. The medical therapy had a particularly significant impact on the inmates. Doctors from Germany collaborated with medical professionals from the United States, picking up new skills and making use of cutting-edge technology. Inmates were given access to medical procedures that would have been reserved only for Germany's most privileged citizens. Treatment for mental health, which was almost unheard of in the Wehrmacht, was made available to troops who had experienced trauma. They addressed people who tried suicide with therapy rather than punishment, according to what Dr. Friedrich Bauer wrote. Instead of being beaten, prisoners who experienced mental breakdowns were given treatment. When it came to adversaries, this humanity exhibited a strength that we had never known before: the confidence that comes with actual power. The covert re-education effort had already yielded extraordinary effects by the time March 1945 rolled around. There were almost 25,000 inmates who had volunteered to take part in democracy classes. In the camp newspapers, articles were published that discussed topics such as civil rights, free markets, and constitutional governance. After the war, Germany's future was a topic of discussion among many factions. The success of the initiative far beyond any and all expectations. For the purpose of composing writings about democratic rebuilding, prisoners who had entered as passionate Nazis were being held. In the aftermath of World War II, officers who had taken oaths to Hitler were formulating strategies for implementing American agricultural practices in Germany. An interview conducted in 1975 revealed that Oberst Hermann Göring, who had no connection to the Reichsmarschall, stated that they had become missionaries for democracy, without resorting to compulsion or propaganda, but rather by means of observation. We witnessed it becoming successful. Compared to the German elite, we witnessed common people having better lives. With regard to Germany, we want that. The metamorphosis was so comprehensive that the authorities in the United States were concerned that the inmates would get overly excited about American methods of doing things. The war ended, and some people asked to remain in the United States. As a result of their participation in prison correspondence programs, some individuals married American women. The 1950s would finally see the arrival of thousands of people to the United States. In April of 1945, the full disclosure was made public. The video was played to German prisoners of war as American forces freed concentration camps in Germany where they were held captive. The proof was overwhelming, including testimony from American soldiers, pictures, newsreels, and finally letters from Germany confirming the atrocity. Initially, many people refused to accept it, believing that it was propaganda. However, the evidence gradually confirmed the tragedy. The psychological repercussions were quite detrimental. Despite the fact that they had been defeated militarily, men who had kept some pride in German honor were now confronted with the full moral collapse of their nation. All of the things that they had fought for were not only vanquished, but also bad. The most eloquent explanation on the subject was written by Hauptmann Walter Schmidt, who stated, "We thought we were warriors for a great cause. It became clear to us that we were being used by crooks. It was our belief that we were bringing civilization to persons of lower social status. It turned out that we were the brutes of the group. The Americans, whom we referred to as feeble and decadent, demonstrated to us what it meant to be a civilized society." Repatriation of German prisoners of war was met with a range of feelings when the war came to an end in May of 1945. The America that they had seen was in direct opposition to all that they had previously thought. Even though they were captives, they received a better diet than troops. Their adversaries had treated them with a higher level of decency than their own government had at any point. The next months of captivity were spent getting ready to return to a Germany that had been completely wrecked. Educational opportunities in the fields of agriculture, politics, and vocational training were made available by the American authorities. Prisoners were aware of the Marshall Plan prior to its announcement, and they were aware that the United States would attempt to reconstruct Germany rather than punish it economically. They made it possible for us to reconstruct our nation, as Oberst Friedrich von Tobien put it in his writing. They provided us with experience, knowledge, and hope. They did this by transforming vanquished troops into residents of the future. For minds that had been formed by the vengeful nature of the Nazis, this benevolence from the victors was inconceivable. There were 371,683 German prisoners of war that were liberated from American facilities between the years 1945 and 1946. Their homecoming brought them back to a Germany that was shattered, ruined, and penniless. The information that they carried with them, however, was extremely valuable. They were aware of the functioning of a democratic industrial society. Those German prisoners of war who were able to witness the affluence of the United States became unknowing agents of change in Germany after the war. They had witnessed the efficiency of the industrial sector, the productivity of agriculture, and the affluence of democracy. Due to the fact that they had seen a civilization that had successfully accomplished rebuilding, they were aware that it was doable. Numerous former prisoners of war came to prominence during the restoration of West Germany. During his time as a prisoner at Camp Shelby, Hans Kroll eventually became the ambassador of West Germany to the United States. During his time at Camp Como, Walter Hallstein was a teacher. He later went on to become the head of the European Commission. At the time of his imprisonment at Camp Herne, Rudiger von Weckmar was serving as the permanent representative of Germany to the United Nations. As a prisoner at Fort Robinson, Eduard Ackermann went on to become a prominent figure in the movement to modernize German agriculture. They introduced American democracy to German politics, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American techniques to German industry. They also brought American efficiency to German agriculture. The economic miracle that occurred in the 1950s was constructed in part on the information that was learned in prison camps in the United States. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll said in his memoirs on the subject of his experiences. It was clear to us that democracy was the source of riches, that variety was the source of strength, and that showing workers respect led to an increase in productivity. The lessons that were learnt while being held captive helped form the new Germany. Historians have referred to the experience of German prisoners of war in the United States as one of the most effective re-education initiatives in the history of the world. With the help of American industrial strength and democracy, hardened Nazis were transformed into future democratic citizens. This transformation did not include any form of force or propaganda in the classic sense. It was not through the use of words, but rather through observation that the program was successful. The prisoners witnessed the American civilization operating at its highest level of efficiency while treating its adversaries with respect. They observed industrial capabilities that made the manufacturing of German goods appear to be of a more humble kind. They were subjected to a level of life that revealed the promises made by the Nazis to be fictitious. The chief historian of German prisoners of war in the United States, Dr. Arnold Kramer, came to the following conclusion. America won the propaganda war not through clever messages, but quite simply through sheer reality. There was an argument against Nazism for every single complete meal, every single electric light, and every single toilet that worked. The prisoners of war were transformed by the wealth. Statistical evidence lends credence to this opinion. Out of the 371,683 German prisoners of war held in the United States, less than 1% made an effort to flee, with a total of only 2,222 being documented. 75% of respondents to post-war polls judged their treatment as either acceptable or outstanding. Perhaps most remarkable is the fact that thousands of people continued to communicate with American relatives for decades after the war. Reunions of German prisoners of war who had survived the war were held in Austin, Texas in 1985, around the 40th anniversary of the war's conclusion. More than 500 formerly incarcerated individuals made their way back to the United States, with many of them bringing their families with them to demonstrate where their change had started. Hans Vey, a former Obergefreiter who had been confined at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and who subsequently returned to Georgetown, Maine to become a physician, delivered a speech at the reunion. He stated, "Life in the camps was a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany. Upon our arrival, we found that there was sufficient food, central heating, and running water. Most importantly, however, we found that we had dignity. The farmers treated us not as enemies, but as young men far from home," said former Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Meyer, who had worked on farms in Iowa. Meyer had previous experience working on farms. They not only shared their meals, but also their expertise and even their houses at times. This compassion from those whose sons were fighting against us was a turning point in our lives that will never be forgotten. At the reunion dinner in 1985, former Oberst Hermann Gott, who was 78 years old at the time, presented the keynote lecture that encapsulated the heart of the metamorphosis. He said, "We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie, as friends, as democratic individuals, and as men who had witnessed the truth. We departed. It was the United States of America that demonstrated to us that power does not originate from conquering, but rather from creation. It is not hatred, but rather variety, and it is not tyranny, but rather freedom. The weaponry of democracy was in full production, and we were able to witness it. Farmers who supplied food for the globe, laborers who constructed the means of triumph, and citizens who handled their adversaries with decency were all individuals who we witnessed. As we discovered, the United States of America's most powerful weapon was not its arsenal of bombs or tanks, but rather its boundless capacity for creativity and its unwavering self-assurance. We went back to Germany with the intention of establishing a civilization that was capable of generating rather than destroying, and that could flourish through peaceful means rather than via violent means. The lessons that were learnt in American prison camps had a significant impact on the Germany that emerged from the ashes. In the beginning, we were conquerors, but now we are scholars. Thank you for guiding us in the right direction, America, from those who were once your adversaries but are now your allies, Americans and Germans who had been adversaries in the past. came together to celebrate a change that had appeared to be unimaginable when those first trains arrived in Texas in June of 1943. The audience exploded in a standing ovation. The extent of the German prisoners of war experience in the United States may be quantified via the use of stark statistics that reflect both the enormity of the operation and the astonishing success it achieved. There are almost 500 camps spread out throughout 45 states, with the exception of Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. There are 175 main camps and 325 branch camps. Each camp is designed to accommodate between 250 and 12,000 convicts. The building of each camp takes an average of 90 days to complete. The number of prisoners was at its highest in May 1945, with an average of 20,000 new arrivals per month in 1943, 30,000 per month following D-Day, and 60,000 per month in the last months of the war. There were 371,783 German prisoners of war, which were a portion of a total of 425,871 enemies, prisoners of war. The contribution of labor included 14 million man-days of agricultural labor, 100 million board feet of lumber processed, $230 million in labor value in the 1940s, and a daily salary of 80 cents for each prisoner. Prisoners supplied key labor shortages in 46 states. There were only 2,222 attempts to escape from over 371,000 inmates, which is 0.6% of the total. There were no successful permanent escapes, and the majority of escapees were recovered within 24 hours. There were no American citizens who were hurt by escaped prisoners of war. Educational initiatives include more than 40,000 students engaged in educational classes, 135 camp newspapers published, 30,000 students attending English classes, 15,000 students participating in vocational training, and 8,000 students doing university correspondence courses. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners of war came to the United States after the war. More than 12,000 of them continued communication with American families, with the average duration of correspondence being 31 years. Many of them returned to the United States as tourists or business partners with American families. In terms of treatment, 95% of respondents assessed the treatment as either good or outstanding. 74% of respondents stated that their worldview was positively altered as a result of captivity. 61% indicated interest in learning about democracy, and less than 10% of respondents held strong Nazi convictions by 1945. The German prisoners of war who were exposed to the industrial power of the United States were not only witnesses to history, they were also altered by it. They were taught via their confinement. They gained wisdom as a result of their failure, and their incarceration turned out to be a deliverance from the ideological restraints that Nazism had imposed on them. Ultimately, the most significant victory for the United States of America was not achieved on the battlefield, but rather in the prison camps. It was there that the overwhelming proof of democratic wealth achieved what armies were unable to, the entire change of the minds of the adversary. The prisoners of war had come with the belief that the Germans were superior and the Americans were weak. After leaving, they were aware of the fact that the industrial power of the United States was not only overwhelming, but it was unfathomable to minds that had been fashioned by oppression and privation. In 1943, the trains that had transported them into captivity had already been used to transport soldiers belonging to the Third Reich. In 1946, the ships that brought them back to Germany were carrying individuals who were builders of democracy. They had a glimpse of the future, and there was success. Their narrative is a witness to a deep truth. The most potent weapon in the armory of the United States of America was not military force, but rather the straightforward and overwhelming proof of a free society's capacity to produce abundance with regard to its resources. Even though the German prisoners of war were awestruck by the industrial power of the United States, they were ultimately transformed by it. The roots of Europe's post-war salvation and the ultimate defeat of the Nazi project were planted in their change. They did not return to Germany as vanquished adversaries, but rather as witnesses to the achievements that might be made by communities that were free. In the 1950s, the economic miracle that transformed West Germany was built on foundations laid in American prison camps. It was in these camps that enemy soldiers learned that prosperity did not come from conquest, but rather from freedom, not from racial superiority, but rather from human dignity, and not from totalitarian control, but rather from democratic cooperation. POWs from Germany had come in the United States with the expectation of discovering a nation that was weak, divided, and on the edge of collapse. On the contrary, they came with an industrial behemoth that possessed unbounded might and a remarkable level of humanity. They had arrived as prisoners of war, but they had departed as witnesses to the armory of democracy performing at its highest possible level. The psychological seeds that would eventually grow into the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the democratic rebuilding of Germany were planted in their astonishment at the riches of the United States. Having visited the United States of America, they would never be the same again. Their children would grow up in a democratic Germany that was allied with the United States. This cooperation would be founded on the change that began when 1,850 veterans of the Africa Corps got off a train in Mexia, Texas, and realized that everything they thought was incorrect. It is ultimately a narrative of redemption via revelation that the story of German prisoners of war in the United States is about, not through destruction, but through demonstration, not through propaganda, but through wealth, not through hatred, but through humanity. This demonstrates that sometimes the greatest wins are achieved not through destruction, but through demonstration. The German troops who were able to experience the industrial power of the United States became the inadvertent ambassadors of democracy. They brought back to their nation the seeds of transformation that would eventually blossom into one of the most successful restorations in the history of the whole world. Their change from Nazi fighters to democratic citizens is still considered to be one of the most extraordinary conversions in contemporary history. This shift was not achieved through the use of force, but rather by the overwhelming proof of what free people were capable of doing because they collaborated. That, in the end, was the hidden weapon that the United States of America possessed. Not just the capability to manufacture more tanks and aircraft than any other nation in the history of the world, but also the ability to turn adversaries into allies through the straightforward power of example. Not only were the German prisoners of war awestruck by the industrial power of the United States, but more crucially, they were transformed by it. In addition, these alterations will build the groundwork for a more ideal world.